Welcome to About Sustainability, a podcast brought to you by the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, or IGES. I'm Alice Yamabe, and in this episode, my co-hosts Dwayne Appleby and Andre Madder had an illuminating discussion about multilateral environmental agreements, or MEAs, and their negotiations. Their guest was none other than IGES Executive Director Hiroshi Ono. With a wealth of experience as part of Japan's negotiation team at various meetings in the past, Ono-san sheds light on how these agreements work and why it is so tough to come to decisions. They began by asking Ono-san about the reasons behind establishing MEAs in the first place.
Previously, in the very old days, most of the pollution are very site specific, so that in most cases each country needed to address the issues of pollution by themselves separately. So each country had their own air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution, and others. But global issues came up, like ozone layer depletion and climate change and acid deposition issues and the chemical issues, which is a transboundary pollution issues. And of course, each country should address those issues. But at the same time, they do need international cooperation to tackle those questions, because the ozone layer depletion and the climate change issues are not site-specific. Whether you emit the pollutants or CO2 in Japan or US and some other countries, the impact to the global environment is virtually the same. So that leads to the concept that the concerted global action will need it to be introduced. And of course, the chemical issues as well. So there is a transboundary pollution issues. Sometimes I remember that in Antarctica or Northern Pole, we found a lot of persistent organic chemicals in ice or in organisms and others. So that necessitated us to tackle those issues globally. So that I think the multilateral environmental agreement concept came into, and that nowadays we have growing number of those issues. Climate change is one issue, but biodiversity issues also there, and chemical issues. Currently, plastic pollution issues newly emerging. So the growing issues which need to be tackled by MEAs are growing. So I think that's the current situation.
Yeah, that perspective is interesting. This whole interdependence of countries. Yeah. Countries are becoming more and more interdependent, and these issues are becoming more blanket issues that affect multiple countries. And what about your personal history with MEAs? I understand that you have been involved in negotiations for much of your career. What is sort of a brief history of your involvement, and which ones have you been involved in?
Yes, I had an working experience in the Ministry of the Environment for more than 35 years. So during my early days working for the Ministry of the Environment, the climate issue is, I think that's the beginning of the climate issues from the Kyoto Protocol. And before that, the IPCC released scientific knowledge a lot on the climate change issues. And then the Kyoto Protocol and other climate issues came out. Of course, before that, the Rio conference agreed on a framework convention on climate change, biodiversity, and others. The biggest experiences on the climate change negotiations intermittently, because the Japanese bureaucratic system, the people move every 2-3 years, and then I sometimes address global issues and then sometimes local issues. But intermittently, I attended COP negotiations. I think more than 10 times. So I have a certain amount of experience in the climate change negotiations. I have virtually no experience in the chemical issues like POPs and Minamata issues, as well as the Basel Convention. I have just a little bit experience in the Basel Convention, but just 1 or 2 times. And on the biodiversity issues, I took part in a COP15, which adopted the global biodiversity framework in Montreal.
Mm-hmm.
So at that time, I was supporting the Minister for the Environment and then involved in negotiations on DSI issues and the finance issues, as well as the framework, Kunming Montreal framework issues. And currently, I'm significantly involved in plastic negotiations. Still, it's an intergovernmental negotiating committee. So we are looking at the global treaty, a plastic pollution treaty, but still we are negotiating. We supposed to conclude the negotiations by the end of last year, but still we have another extension of one session this summer. So I do hope that we could conclude that negotiations in August in Geneva.
Right.
So that's my brief history of engagement.
Okay, and that last one, just for listeners, that the INC that you mentioned is the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee on Plastic Pollution, which, as far as I understand, we'll probably get into it later, but as far as I understand, it's an assessment-oriented agreement. Is that correct? Because people have said it's similar to IPBES and IPCC. Is that kind of, or is it a different nature to those?
Basically, it's more like climate agreement rather than scientific assessment type of negotiation and convention. Because although we are very much aware of the plastic pollution on the beach and others, but still there are significant lack of scientific data in terms of the impact of plastic pollution, in terms of the amount of discharge and whatever. So it's not assessment type of convention like IPCC and IPBES, but rather it's a political endeavor to develop a framework to tackle plastic pollution.
I see.
Building on this discussion, if we could talk a little bit about your views, your experience with MEAs, and what are the strengths and weaknesses of the global community coming together to work on these issues? Maybe we can see recently in the INC, as you mentioned, one of the challenges is getting everyone to agree. But I'd be interested to know your reflections on that, given your experience.
Yes, all the negotiations, COP negotiations, INC negotiations involve 190 or all the countries, basically. So it's a kind of stressful and painful process, so to speak, because it is, you can imagine that it is quite difficult to get a consensus of all countries. I don't say that each country has veto, but still we need a quite broad consensus to conclude the negotiations. So that's a quite difficult process and time-consuming process. But it's in a spirit of no one left behind. Virtually, it's SDG spirit, and even if it is quite time-consuming and stressful and frustrating, but I think it is the only way for us to move forward, to get together all the international community to tackle certain challenge.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder then, I think maybe from your answer, I think I already know the next answer, but what would you say to people who look at MEAs and say, oh, it's not ambitious enough, it's too slow, it's too incremental? What would you say to people who view these negotiations in that way?
Yes. For example, if you take plastic negotiations, for example, NGOs and some European countries and others say that, they argue that quite ambitious target, for example, in the capping on the plastic production and global listing of chemicals and eliminate those chemicals within certain time period. But from the perspective of other, a group of countries who are producing plastic, the plastic production is their, major source of income for oil producing countries and others. So it's quite difficult for them to reduce their, source of income in a certain period of time. And in terms of the chemicals and others, many countries don't have enough scientific capacity or scientific knowledge, whether which chemicals are harmful and to what extent and those sort of things. We don't have enough scientific data from that perspective. So there are quite, different perspective from different countries. So one side of countries might say that this is not not enough ambitious enough, and we should do more. But other group of countries say that it is too ambitious and it is not realistic, not implementable. So we need to find a balance, and we need to find the landing zone of many different perspectives. So that's a exercise we are doing over the last 2-3 years. So it's a necessary process. I hear a lot of argument from both sides and from different countries, and each of them has quite a good, justification from their perspective. Not agreed by many, but each country has their justification, their cause, and their national circumstances. So I think we need to carefully hear all those views and then find the, final landing zone where we could start. But this is not the end of the process. And usually, if you take climate, framework conventions and Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement, the measures, countermeasures are evolving over time. So just the starting point is not the ending point. So if we can have a good start with as many countries as possible, we can evolve over time.
Yeah, I think the point that you raised about these tensions that exist between different groups of countries that may emphasize economic growth or stability over ambition on particular issues. I think this is really well taken and leads, I guess, to the other consideration around these discussions is once an agreement is made, who pays. Where does the finance come from? And I wonder, do you see any easy pathways towards funding and resourcing for these different agreements? I think the answer is no. I think I know this already, but I guess I'm just thinking my background is a lot in international development, and so I'm always thinking when I look at international negotiations about the arguments around historic responsibility versus current and future responsibility, different capacity gaps, and I just wonder, what your thoughts are on that, how that plays a role in these discussions, and if we're making any progress on finding solutions.
Thank you for that question. And the funding and resource mobilization is always most difficult issues to solve. And I had a very painful experience and on that funding and financial negotiations. But what I see in the negotiation process is that we usually always go back to the traditional or conventional argument of developed and developing, issues. But if you say developing countries and developed country, it has never been changed over 30, 40 years, even 50 years. So it doesn't reflect the current economic conditions of each countries. There are quite a number of so-called developing countries who are richer than developed countries, but they usually argue that we are in a developing country category, so we don't have to pay. Of course, we can voluntarily contribute to any South-South cooperation and others, but the responsibility is on the developed country side. So that's the traditional argument, and all the time, and it is quite stressful. The developed country side say that it doesn't reflect the current situation of economic conditions. So even in the developing country groups, a lot of majority is on the developing country group, but there of course quite diversified groups and countries. In the negotiation, it usually happens that they stick together and they align themselves as a group because they don't want to differentiate it. Otherwise, some of the countries may be, urged to contribute something. So they stick together to argue that they are in a developing country group, and it is impossible to, categorize among the developing country groups. They want to enjoy their, privilege to, receive financial support from so-called developed countries. That's a historical argument, and many of the countries, informally, they say that it is not so logical. And so it doesn't reflect, actual situation of economic conditions. But when it comes to the negotiations, the official position remain the same because it is more beneficial for them as a group. But I think what comes into my mind is in the UN system and UN contributions, there's a specific formula to calculate contribution to UN. And also developing countries are also contributing to the UN. Personally, I usually think that if that system, UN contribution system, could apply over to all, environmental agreement and financial mechanisms. So it might be a more fair and transparent, but it never happens because all countries should agree on the, the mechanisms and agreement. So I cannot foresee that will happen in next classic conventions and others. It never has, but I really hope that that kind of uniform formula of contributions could prevail across the MEAs. So that might be more reasonable.
You mentioned the role of kind of South-South partnerships or South-South activities, and so I'm wondering if you think, stepping back from just looking at global MEAs, if there is a strong role that could be played by regional or South-South MEAs that maybe leave out some of the developed countries, if we want to use that terminology, and kind of had funding that's maybe it's flowing around in the BRICS countries or something, or if that opens up a different set of political problems.
Yes, basically the regional bodies quite important role to play. For example, historically, the asset deposition, asset rain issues started from some European countries, Northern European countries, and UK and others. So it was kind of regional problem. So they could agree on some convention on the asset deposition. And of course, the ASEAN and other regional bodies are quite active in tackling many environmental issues, climate, of course, biodiversity, plastic as well. So they are very, very active. But when it comes to the convention or treaty, so it can be solved by some specific region inside the region. But usually, I think the funding issue will emerge, who will pay in the same kind of situation. And just a small number of developed countries are not so happy to, bear all the, and the supporting provided to the developing countries. So, yes, the regional convention or treaty or agreement can play a significant role depending on the nature of the issues. But if it is global issues like plastic, climate, and others, I think there is a little bit kind of limited role in terms of regional bodies to play. So we need, I think, we need a global solution that necessitates the development of MEAs, which is, of course, difficult, but yes, it is a little bit difficult to find alternative ways to tackle.
What about the number of MEAs? I have heard that there's something like 400 globally. Not all at the global level. I think some of them are these regional agreements. Some of them we would never have heard of. But anyway, a very large number. And also my sense is that number proliferates. There's never a time when there's less MEAs than the year before. Do you think that's something that we need to be careful of? Because I know at least in the biodiversity realm, there's a fair amount of overlap between the different MEAs and therefore, potential waste of resources. And also maybe even more seriously, more consequentially, especially the poorer countries are less able to pay attention to all of these different negotiations that are going on, and they have to prioritize the biggest ones. So, streamlining may be an impossible process, but do you think it's something that perhaps the world should aim for?
I know that there are a couple of regional seas, convention or agreement in each, the seas, Mediterranean and Caribbean and others. So usually East Asian region is one of the most difficult region to agree on something as a convention. We have a kind of soft type of programs, action plan or others, but you could imagine that it is politically quite difficult to agree on something very, very concrete. But still, the Mediterranean, European, and African, and Caribbean, and others, so they have some more, convergence in views on specific issues, so they can play a role. And usually, I'm not so aware of the specific, regional conventions. But if you take plastic pollution, for example, each regional sea has its, conventions, programs, action plan to tackle plastic pollution. But still, we are exploring the way to have global issues. One reason is that there is a transboundary, pollution in terms of plastic. So regional actions have kind of limited role to play in terms of tackling global issues. And other reason is that, for example, plastic production and consumption is a global market issues. A lot of global companies produce a lot of plastic polymers, and they are further crafted into products by national and more small scale companies. But source of the production polymer are from quite limited number of global companies. Their activities are global, so basically it is difficult for a regional scheme to control or regulate, manage their actions. And another issues from the production side is that they don't want kind of fragmented regulation scheme, because they are acting globally. So the fragmented regulation requirements by each region or by each countries may hinder their effectiveness of production and activities. So they do need a global level playing field. So with those reasoning, I think even if regional schemes are quite active and important, so we still need some global regime.
In the case of biodiversity conventions, I'm sure there are various regional ones that I'm not aware of, but even at the global level, there are at least 7 conventions that are regarded as biodiversity related, and then there are a few others like the Whaling Convention, which you could definitely regard as an add-on to that. And they're all global, but they each deal with a separate particular issue. And in the case of these ones, what happened was that the more specific conventions developed first, and then after all of them, the CBD, which is more of an umbrella convention, developed. But when it came up, they didn't amalgamate all the others. They let them keep on going, and then the CBD carried on separately. And as a result, there's quite a lot of duplication. And some would argue that that's a bit of a waste of resources. I don't know if that's the case in other fields like climate and plastics. And I also don't know if the answer is to really just put all these together. But I sometimes wonder if we could be a bit more efficient with our time and resources if those were just all put under one umbrella. But it seems like the institutional structures are just too fixed in place to move them.
Yes, that always happen, and even in a country level, usually before agreeing, negotiating a global regime, each country has their own national policies. And always happening is that when you come into the negotiation room, each country don't want to change their national policies because it is more suitable for them. Of course, it's developed by them, accommodating their own national circumstances. So they don't want to be interfered with something, globally, and then change their national system, which might undermine the effectiveness of implementation at the national level. So regional conventions and schemes have in the same kind of situations, and if they are perfectly suitable to the regional circumstances, environment, some global scheme might come in, and so they might need to change their policies and measures. So in order to prevent or overcome those challenges, a global scheme need to have something very beneficial and some power to overcome their national or regional benefits. In terms of the biodiversity issues, I have not so rich an experience and knowledge about biodiversity issues, but biodiversity measures basically very site-specific. Global issues not so common. Yeah.
Yeah.
But in terms of for example, digital sequencing, DSI issues, so it could be solved globally because for example, pharmaceutical companies, their activities are global and they're going to any countries in the world, and then the developing countries may want to, charge something or get money from the activities of pharmaceutical companies. So only a global scheme can address that issues. So it is very strong reasoning to have a global scheme. In terms of the climate change issues, of course, as I said, wherever you emit CO2, even Africa, Asia, US, and others, the impact is the same. So we need a global scheme to equalize the burden to each country. So in terms of multilateral environment agreements, so we need something to overcome the benefit of each nations or each regions to tackle. So if we cannot find that very persuasive reasoning and logic to overcome the national and regional schemes, we cannot make it.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly, since we were talking about biodiversity a bunch, I wanted to get in a little bit from the sustainable consumption and production lens. Just thinking about the various agreements that are already in effect and the ones under negotiations, I can think maybe the INC on plastic pollution is probably the closest that comes to something very strictly focusing on production and consumption.
Yeah.
And I always think, every environmental problem, whether, climate change, pollution, biodiversity loss, these are all the results of overconsumption. Every environmental problem is a human behavioral problem. And so I wonder if from your experience, what you see in the MEAs and the various negotiations, when we start to try and tackle overconsumption, does it become more difficult for countries to see a benefit to overcoming their own national policies or regional policies? Is it a more politically sensitive issue or economically sensitive issue when we start talking about consumption and production?
I agree that most of the environment issues stem from the overconsumption, maybe overproduction. The climate issues comes from the overconsumption of fossil fuels, and plastic pollution is overconsumption of plastic products. So I think the overproduction and consumption issue is prevailing issues across many environmental issues, but it is quite country-specific and person-specific issues. It's quite related to personal behavior issues. So when I see in the plastic negotiation process, virtually all countries argue that our culture and consumption pattern and is quite different from yours. The temperature is quite different, and our culture is quite different from you. So most of them argue that they cannot be controlled or managed by the global, uniform rule of consumption and production issues. So that comes out all the time. And one possible solution we are exploring is that we have, kind of generic or general criteria, guidelines, rules, not so prescriptive, but the general concept, general rules should be in a convention or treaty, and then each country have some flexibility to apply those general rules to their own countries. So I think from my point of view, that kind of approach is the only solution to reach agreement by all countries.
Yeah, and it sounds also that approach would open the door to allowing transition to become more just as well, reflecting the values and priorities of local communities, as opposed to, as you said, being very prescriptive from the global level.
A little bit unrelated, but seeing as we're sort of picking apart the pros and cons of MEAs, something that I've often wondered about, and Dwayne and I have spoken about in the past, is this issue of consensus. So in the case of the CBD, no decision will go ahead unless every single party there, and there's 196 of them, has agreed to it, or at least in rare cases there'll be one or two parties who could have agreed to let it go ahead as long as it's noted that they didn't really, they weren't happy about it. And then on the other hand, you have conventions. I think the International Whaling Convention is one of these, where you need a certain percentage of the vote, something like 60%. And I guess this varies from convention to convention. Do you have any opinion on which is the best strategy? Because, of course, if you require consensus, it waters down the text because everyone has to agree on the outcome. Whereas if you require a smaller number of people to agree, then that can have other negative effects. I'm not sure if you have any opinion on that issue.
Yes, the issue of consensus-based approach or kind of majority or voting-based approach is always an issue for our negotiations. And in terms of the environment, at least major multilateral environmental agreement, virtually they take consensus-based approach, even though in the convention there is a system of voting, three-quarter majority or something like that, but it rarely happen. The voting rarely happen, especially in substantive issues, because it's a problem for all multilateral agreement that we cannot have enforcement mechanisms because we cannot, enforce and put them in jail or fine or something. Usually, so we don't have any, General Security Council type of body to enforce that implementation. So, if parties are really unhappy about the decision or issues, they can easily, say goodbye to that convention. And it happened in the Kyoto Protocol and others. In order to prevent and keep at least major countries on board, I think we need to take a consensus-based approach. Otherwise, we will lose the number of countries who engage with that convention. And this is a reality of the international negotiations. For example, in the climate issues, usually the developing countries always have the majority. And if you can take decisions by voting on the financial issues, it is easily concluded that developed countries should pay and developing countries will only receive that financial support. But if that takes place, that all the developed countries will move from the convention, we can easily, assume that. So that will also happen in the plastic pollution. For example, in terms of the production of plastic polymers, minority number of countries produce plastic polymers. Developed countries and some emerging economies, and most of the countries are not producing plastic polymers. So under that situation, if you take a decision by voting on, for example, say the capping plastic production, giving some target numbers, that decision can easily be taken by majority, but the same as the climate convention, that all the producing countries will move from the convention, and that will make the convention ineffective. Right. So with that consideration thinking, I think the consensus-based approach will be the most, it is, the time-consuming and frustrating and very stressful. But I think basically consensus-based approach is the only effective way of decision making, and some exceptions may be very purely scientific issues. We cannot, take a majority vote for a scientific knowledge. So if it is a quite scientific issues, and the scientist can take decisions by some way of, the majority or minority or voting or something. But usually when it comes to the political issues, I don't think the voting process will work well.
Actually, that leads quite neatly into another question we wanted to ask, which was the difference between, I'm not sure if there's a term for it, but these multilateral agreements which are assessment-oriented, like IPBES and IPCC, versus the ones which are perhaps more political. So their counterpart, the IPCC counterpart is the UNFCCC, and IPBES's counterpart is the CBD. So just to use those two as an example, the more assessment-oriented ones are, as you say, more scientifically oriented ones. Do you think that we might see more tension on that kind of multilateral agreement compared to the more politically oriented ones? And this might sound like an obscure question, but the reason I'm wondering is that I get the sense that the more political conventions are receiving more and more pushback from a lot of countries like the US, especially at the moment.
Yes, basically, in terms of the environment issues, usually we need data, scientific knowledge, and professional judgment. So I think the combination of scientific assessment, IPCC are not the convention, but the scientific, group to assess the impact and others. So I think IPCC and the Climate Convention, Paris Agreement are quite really one typical or one very ideal combination of two issues, because if you mix up those science and political issues, the politicians easily affect scientific knowledge. So that's what we are, seeing right now. So one ideal, the format is that scientific assessment body. It's independent from political process, and then political conventions which deal with the actual countermeasures and finance issues. So IPBES and CBD is another good example. In terms of the plastic, we are also thinking about whether we should have a scientific assessment process or mechanisms in the instrument, or we should have separate independent panel or something on the scientific issues. And my preference is that they separate science and policy decision-making process.
Yeah, I guess it would be great to do that right from the start, right? Because at least for biodiversity, it was a 20-year gap between the establishment of the CBD and the establishment of IPBES. So if they do decide to do that separately, it would be great if it could happen early in the process.
Yes, there are several different patterns, and in terms of the climate, IPCC first, and then climate convention later. And CBD, in case of CBD, the CBD was established in 1992, and then IPBES, years later, the IPBES will be established. So I think IPBES works very well to provide support to the CBD. So in terms of the plastic, I cannot say what will happen, but so those different process may be established concurrently at the same time, or the political process may a little bit go ahead earlier. well, I'm not sure, but in either case, I think at the end we should have some independent scientific panel or something to assess the scientific evidence and data.
I think that this might be a good segue into our last kind of topic. We've talked a little bit about when politics and science kind of clash, and we've talked a little bit about looking into the future of what INC might result in. And so I'm wondering if we could take one step further and think about, given what we see, the trends that are happening within governments and civil society in many countries around the world, if we can think about what the future of multilateral environmental agreements might be. We're dealing with an environment where science is becoming politicized in some countries. There's misinformation and disinformation that then puts pressure on governments. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, if you've seen any impacts from those things already, and if you think that they'll play a larger role in the future, maybe a challenge.
Yes. Ideally, the scientific body provides some factual data and information, and then political bodies will take that recommendation and data information and make informed decision making. And this is ideal, but one thing come in my mind is that in the climate field, a lot of scientific process is kind of politicized. The policy can somewhat control scientific process by deciding whether they should provide support or provide the space for scientists to play. Unfortunately, this happens in some cases, and we cannot completely, eliminate that situation. And the issue is how we can safeguard that issues. And another one is, for example, in IPCC and climate issues. From scientists' side, yes, the 1.5 degree target is quite, important and achievable. Probably the zero, so no increase of, the temperature is ideal from the scientific point of view. But when you look at the reality of the everyday life and economies and others, sometimes the economic situation may not allow countries to take the exact pathway towards 1.5 degrees. So I think in diverse issues, the same thing may happen. So scientists say that 30 by 30 or 40 by 40 or 50 by 50 or whatever. But in reality, it is quite difficult to, take that, target, depending on the economic and other social conditions. So there might be some gap between scientific knowledge, scientific recommendation, and political realities, because all the measures, policies are decided by political side. So the political side may prevail. But still, the role of science is quite tricky. So whether the scientists should stick to their very basic issues, like saying 1.5 should be strictly followed, or preferably 1.0 or 0.5 degrees may be preferable. If they stick to their argument, the political side may move from the science knowledge. So I think it is always very controversial as well as very tricky how each side can move together. The scientists might say that no, you cannot change any scientific knowledge, but we all know that still in the science side there are some flexibility or some range of knowledge, and so I think both sides could better work by coming closer and enhance communication. What I see nowadays is that division of science and political side. So I think that's a problem, and if that continues, the political side will decide whatever they want to decide. Looking at the very short period of time and very short-sighted. We are in a democratic country, so probably every few years we have an election, and it is difficult for a politician to think about 20, 50, or 100 years later. So the short cycle of election could make great impact on the policy decision, and so we need to think very carefully about what is the right communications and right interactions and right relationship between policy and the science side.
This is maybe a little bit beyond the scope of the discussion, but a few times while you were speaking now, I thought about the media and the way that the media interprets the results of especially IPCC and IPBES and that kind of thing. And I think that is kind of a part of the puzzle, right? Especially these days with social media being so pervasive, it's just everywhere. And you find, for example, and I think especially with the IPCC, you got these very dense reports that they produce, which 5 people in the world have actually read the whole report, and another 15 people have read the whole SPM. But then it's easy to cherry pick information. So you get, I think, from the left and the right, or from different ends of the political spectrum, let's say, you see very different interpretations of the data. And that presumably also affects the political. You spoke about this gap between the scientific and the political, and I guess the media is kind of filling part of that gap in maybe not a very useful way. So I guess my question would be, is that something that worries you as well, or do you think that's sort of an issue that we need to be aware of?
Yes, I think that's quite important issues. And of course, there's a pros and cons. Media, social media, and of course, traditional media are quite important to convey any kind of information and political message, scientific findings to general public. And without such media, it is quite difficult to inform the latest scientific knowledge to general public. So the media is quite important, but at the same time, there is always a problem, like kind of exaggeration and miscommunication issues, because media usually take issues in a very simpler way and exaggerated way to attract the attention of general public. Sometimes we need that kind of approach to attract the attention of general public, but what we are seeing is, in terms of the climate and the media and other social media, something very extreme. And the saying that this is a scientific finding and IPCC tells like this. But if you look at the exact report of the IPCC, so the contents are not the same as what was broadcasted. So those issues always happen, and we need to be very, careful. And from our, IGES perspective, we are in the middle of the science side and the political side. We are, research institution, but looking at the policy issues as well. So, in terms of the role of IGES, we cannot, communicate the whole IPCC report, whole IPBES report, and it is quite difficult to say this is the right information and this is the wrong information, and there's a kind of graduation issues. But what we can do is to try to find a real message and right message from the IPCC scientific side, and then not to simplify too much, but simplify enough to understandable to the general public. So it's a quite challenging issues, but we should tackle those issues as an institution.
As well as, thinking about communication to the general public or communication. I think that one of the roles that research institutions like IGES play is taking the scientific information and making it digestible to policymakers as well, because there's not always, that capacity within government, especially when you're dealing with cutting edge science and research. It changes, sometimes every year. And so I think that's a strong role that we can play here.
Yes, I totally agree, and we are, providing a series of, webinars and other COP before and after COPs and other international processes, and a lot of, audience are participating in that seminars. I think the majority is from industry side, business side, so because they really need, very updated and correct scientific and other informations to drive or to operate their business. So, of course, the general public also very important audience for us, but business and other, the major audience. So we need to provide the more customized information. We need to provide more updated information to our, targeted audience, and that's what I just should look into more, carefully.
Thank you for listening to About Sustainability. Please subscribe at podcast.iges.jp or search for About Sustainability wherever you normally get your podcasts. If you've got feedback, you can review us on your podcast directory of choice or reach out on Twitter at IGES_EN. About Sustainability is produced by the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. Any views expressed during the podcast are those of the speaker at the time of recording and do not necessarily reflect the views of IGES. Thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. We don't take that lightly, and we hope you'll join us next time.